Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient battlefield, where the fate of empires hung in the balance with every decision made by a single leader, or walking through the grand halls of a forgotten palace, where whispers of power and ambition still echo through time. These are the moments that shaped the world we live in today, moments driven by the minds and wills of history's most influential ancient leaders. From the fierce conquerors who expanded their realms with unmatched strategy, to the visionary thinkers whose ideas still guide us centuries later, these figures didn't just rule, they transformed civilizations, leaving legacies that ripple across millennia. What does it take to bend the arc of history? Was it sheer force, divine inspiration, or something deeper? An understanding of human nature that allowed these leaders to unite, innovate, and endure. Think of the pharaohs who built monuments so mighty they defied time itself, or the philosophers whose words became the bedrock of modern thought. These weren't just rulers, they were architects of destiny, crafting the blueprint for everything from governance to culture, warfare to wisdom. And their stories aren't just relics of the past, they're alive in the systems we use, the borders we recognize, even the way we think about power and leadership today. This is a journey through the lives of 35 of history's most extraordinary minds, each a master of influence in their own right. Some wielded swords, others wielded ideas, but all of them changed the course of human history in ways that still resonate. You'll meet kings who turned barren lands into thriving empires, queens who outmaneuvered their rivals with brilliance, and thinkers whose revelations rewrote the rules of society. So let's step into their world where every decision carried the weight of centuries, and where the echoes of their choices still shape our lives in ways you might not even realize. The past isn't just a story, it's the foundation of our present, and these leaders, they laid every stone. Picture a world where justice was carved in stone, literally. That's exactly what Hammurabi of Babylon gave humanity over 3,700 years ago. As the sixth king of the first Babylonian dynasty, he didn't just rule, he transformed chaos into order with a weapon far mightier than any sword, the law. His code of Hammurabi, etched onto towering basalt steels across his empire, wasn't just a list of rules, it was a revelation, a radical idea that justice should be written, visible to all, and applied equally, at least in principle. These steels, some standing over 7 feet tall, weren't hidden in palaces or temples. Hammurabi had them planted in city squares where farmers, merchants, and slaves could see them. Imagine walking through bustling Babylon, glancing up at those imposing black stones covered in wedge-shaped cuneiform script. The message was clear: no one was above the law, not even the king. At the top of each stele, Hammurabi himself is depicted receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, a divine stamp of approval that blended authority with spirituality. But what made these laws revolutionary? For starters, they introduced something unheard of at the time: proportionality. An eye for an eye wasn't just a saying, it was the legal standard. If a builder's shoddy work caused a house to collapse and kill the owner, that builder faced execution. Yet the code also showed surprising nuance. It distinguished between accidental harm and intentional crime, offered protections for the vulnerable, even set prices for goods and services to prevent exploitation. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about creating a functioning, fair society. Hammurabi's genius lay in understanding that laws could bind a fractured Mesopotamia together. Before him, the region was a patchwork of city-states constantly at war. By standardizing justice from Babylon to Ur, he gave diverse people a shared system, a blueprint for stability that helped trade flourish, families thrive, and power centralize. Modern legal systems still echo his innovations, from the concept of written statutes to the idea that laws should be publicly accessible. Yet the code wasn't perfect by today's standards. Justice depended on your social class. A noble's fine for injuring a commoner was far lighter than the reverse. but for its time, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Hammurabi didn't just want to rule, he wanted to civilize, to leave a legacy that outlasted conquests. Those steles did more than list laws. They announced to history that order could be carved from chaos, that a society could be built on more than just force. And in doing so, a Babylonian king became immortal. His name whispered not just in histories of war, but in the very evolution of how humanity governs itself. Hammurabi's eye for an eye principle might sound brutal to modern ears, but in its time it was a staggering leap toward fairness. Before his code, justice was often arbitrary. Vengeance could spiral out of control, with whole families wiped out over minor disputes. By demanding that punishments match the crime, Hammurabi didn't just legitimize retaliation, he contained it. Think of it as the ancient world's first attempt at balance, no more, no less. But here's where it gets controversial. While the principle aimed for equity, it wasn't universal. The same injury carried different consequences depending on who you were. Strike a nobleman, lose your hand, but if a nobleman struck you, a mere fine. The code wasn't blind, it saw social rank clearly, embedding inequality into its very fabric. Yet Hammurabi's influence stretches far beyond Babylon. Take a look at modern legal systems and you'll spot his fingerprints, the idea that laws should be written down, accessible to all. That's Hammurabi, the concept of proportional punishment, that's him too. Even the structure of legal codes today, organized by subject with specific consequences for specific actions, echoes his approach. But there's a crucial difference. Modern law strives for equality, at least in theory. Hammurabi's code accepted hierarchy as natural, even just. It's a reminder of how far we've come and how much further some societies still have to go. Archaeology has brought Hammurabi's world vividly to life. In 1901, a French team unearthed the most complete stele of his code in Susa, where it had been taken as war plunder centuries after his death. This 7-foot slab, now in the Louvre, preserves 282 laws in crisp cuneiform. But it's not just about the words. The stele's artistry tells its own story. Hammurabi stands reverently before Shamash, the sun god, who hands him a rod and ring, symbols of divine authority. This wasn't just a legal document, it was propaganda, a way to say, "My rule is blessed by the gods." Other discoveries fill in the gaps. Clay tablets from his reign reveal a bustling economy, with records of grain shipments, court cases, even wages for laborers. One tablet details the construction of a temple, right down to the daily beer rations for workers. These aren't dry administrative notes, they're snapshots of a society Hammurabi shaped, where order and documentation became the glue holding everything together. Critics argue his code was more about control than justice, a tool to consolidate power by standardizing behavior. But supporters point to its protections for the vulnerable, like clauses shielding debtors from perpetual slavery or ensuring fair wages. It's a paradox, a system both progressive and deeply unequal, revolutionary yet rigid. That tension is what makes Hammurabi's legacy so enduring. He didn't just give us laws, he gave us the very idea that society could be structured by rules, not just rulers. And in a world where power often goes unchecked, that's a principle worth remembering. Few rulers defied expectations as boldly as Hatshepsut, the woman who didn't just sit on Egypt's throne, she reshaped it to fit her vision. In a civilization where gods were male and pharaohs were warriors, she ascended to power not through conquest but through sheer political brilliance. While most female rulers of Egypt ruled as regents for underage sons, Hatshepsut did the unthinkable. She declared herself pharaoh, adopting the full titles and regalia of a male king, complete with a false beard and kilt. But this wasn't mere costume play. It was a masterstroke of propaganda, a way to legitimize her rule in a society that saw leadership as inherently masculine. Her reign began as regent for her stepson Thutmose III, but within 7 years she'd rewritten the script. Temple walls suddenly showed her divine birthright. carved scenes depicting the god Ammon himself conceiving her with her mother. This wasn't just history, it was heavenly endorsement, a claim that she was always meant to rule. And rule she did for over 2 decades of unprecedented peace and prosperity while other kingdoms waged war. But Hatshepsut's weapons weren't spears and chariots, they were architects and traders. Her most stunning legacy rises from the cliffs of Deir el-Bahri, a mortuary temple so grand it still takes breath away 3,500 years later. Unlike the blocky pyramids of her predecessors, this was elegance carved into stone. Terraced colonnades mirroring the natural rock face, chapels glowing with gold leaf, gardens of exotic myrrh trees brought from her legendary trading expedition to Punt. That voyage alone revolutionized Egypt's economy, bringing back ivory, ebony, and living incense trees, luxuries that filled her coffers and cemented her as a ruler of vision, not just power. Yet for all her achievements, Hatshepsut nearly vanished from history. After her death, Thutmose III ordered her name chiseled off monuments, her statues toppled, her image erased. For centuries, Egyptologists assumed this was vengeance, a stepson destroying the woman who'd usurped his throne. But newer evidence suggests a different motive, not spite but politics. By removing her from the royal lineage, Thutmose could claim direct succession from his father, simplifying his own legacy. The irony, in trying to erase her, he preserved her. The very act of hacking away her name drew modern archaeologists' attention, making us ask who was important enough to destroy. Today, her temple stands restored, its reliefs whispering tales of a queen who dared to be king. The myrrh trees are long gone, but their roots changed Egypt forever. Just like Hatshepsut herself, she proved that legitimacy isn't just inherited, it's built stone by stone, trade route by trade route. And though her statues were shattered, her greatest monument endures, the unshakable truth that leadership has no gender, only vision. The mystery of Hatshepsut's erased legacy is a puzzle that's taken centuries to piece together. Why would a pharaoh who built monuments on such a grand scale vanish from official records? Early Egyptologists assumed it was personal, a stepson's revenge against the woman who kept him from power. But modern research paints a more complex picture. Thutmose III didn't just erase her, he waited 2 decades after her death to do it. If this was about anger, why the delay? Some scholars now believe it was less about Hatshepsut herself and more about securing the royal lineage. By removing her reign from history, Thutmose could present himself as the direct successor to his father, simplifying the dynastic story for future generations. Then there's the question of her mummy. For years, archaeologists debated which of the unidentified female mummies in the Valley of the Kings might be Hatshepsut. The breakthrough came in 2007 when a single tooth found in a canopic jar was matched to a previously overlooked mummy, an overweight woman in her 50s with reddish hair and an arthritic knee. DNA analysis confirmed her connection to the Thutmoside line, but it also revealed something startling. She likely died from an abscess caused by that very missing tooth, possibly aggravated by a carcinogenic skin lotion found in her tomb. Even in death, Hatshepsut defied expectations a ruler brought low not by war or conspiracy, but by something as ordinary as an infection. Her influence stretched far beyond her lifetime. Cleopatra, the most famous female pharaoh, may have looked to Hatshepsut's playbook centuries later. Both women used divine imagery to bolster their authority, Cleopatra as Isis, Hatshepsut as the daughter of Ammon. Both prioritized trade over territorial expansion, understanding that wealth could be as powerful as armies. But where Hatshepsut masked her femininity to rule, Cleopatra weaponized hers, leveraging her identity as both queen and mother to secure alliances. Their contrasting strategies highlight the impossible tightrope ancient women in power walked: conform to masculine ideals or redefine femininity as strength. Perhaps Hatshepsut's greatest legacy was proving that a woman could not only hold the throne but thrive on it. Her reign saw no major revolts, no crippling defeats, just 2 decades of stability, artistry, and prosperity. The very fact that Thutmose had to work so hard to erase her speaks volumes. You don't chisel away someone who didn't matter. In the end, those defaced monuments became inadvertent testimony to her significance, whispering across millennia that leadership isn't about gender but vision, and that no amount of chiseling can erase a legacy built in stone. Ashoka the Great began his rule as a conqueror, his name etched in blood across the Kalinga battlefield where 100,000 fell and 150,000 were dragged away as slaves. That victory in 261 B.C. should have been his crowning glory. Instead, the carnage broke him. Legend says he walked among the mutilated corpses, hearing the wails of widows, and something inside him shattered. This wasn't glory, it was horror. In a staggering pivot, the man who built his empire on war became history's most unexpected advocate for peace, embracing Buddhism not just as a personal faith but as state policy. His transformation wasn't quiet or private. Ashoka broadcast his remorse and his new vision across the subcontinent. He commissioned edicts carved into rocks and towering pillars, some reaching over 40 feet high, placed along trade routes and pilgrimage sites so no traveler could miss them. These weren't dry decrees, they were raw confessions mixed with radical ideals. One edict near Kalinga admits, "The beloved of the gods was filled with remorse for the slaughter there." Imagine a ruler today erecting monuments to apologize for war crimes. It would be unthinkable, but Ashoka did more than apologize. He redefined power itself, declaring conquest through righteousness more noble than conquest by the sword. The pillars tell the story best, topped with intricate carvings of lions, bulls, and elephants. They bore inscriptions in local dialects so ordinary people could understand them. The lion capitals, especially the one at Sarnath, now India's national emblem, weren't just art. They were manifestos. Between the animal symbolism laid directives to end animal sacrifices, promote vegetarianism, and treat all religions with respect. One edict ordered officials to plant banyan trees and dig wells along roads for travelers' shade and water. Another mandated medical care for humans and animals alike. This wasn't just governance, it was compassion codified into law. Ashoka's reach extended far beyond his borders. He sent Buddhist missionaries as far as Syria, Egypt, and Sri Lanka, not to conquer but to converse. His son and daughter personally carried saplings of the sacred Bodhi tree to Sri Lanka, where they still thrive today. The irony is profound. A king who once expanded his empire by force became its greatest cultural exporter through peace. Even his adversaries respected him. Greek kings like Antiochus II mentioned receiving his envoys, proof that Ashoka's voice carried weight in the Hellenistic world. Yet his legacy is a paradox. The same man who preached nonviolence maintained a standing army. He urged restraint but ruled absolutely. Some scholars argue his peaceful reign saw suppressed revolts and secret police monitoring dissent. But maybe that's the point. Ashoka wasn't a saint. He was a ruler who dared to question whether power had to be cruel, who used his authority to amplify mercy in a world that expected only might. His pillars still stand today, weathered but unbroken, whispering that even the fiercest hearts can change, and that the mark of a true leader isn't just the territory they seize, but the future they plant. Ashoka's radical embrace of nonviolence didn't just echo through ancient India. It rippled across centuries, surfacing in places even he couldn't have imagined. Take Mahatma Gandhi, the man who would one day shake the British Empire without firing a shot. Though separated by over 2,000 years, the two leaders shared an uncanny symmetry. Gandhi openly revered Ashoka's edicts, particularly the rock inscriptions that framed justice as compassion rather than control. Both men understood the paradox. Real strength isn't in crushing your enemy, but in refusing to become what you oppose. When Gandhi launched his Salt March in 1930, defying colonial laws with nothing but quiet determination, he was walking the same philosophical path Ashoka carved into those stone pillars, proving moral authority could outmuscle armies. But the connections run deeper than inspiration. Modern human rights frameworks owe surprising debts to Ashoka's vision. The concept that rulers have a duty to care for their people's well-being, enshrined in everything from public hospitals to environmental protections, finds early expression in his edicts. One pillar orders officials to work for the welfare of the whole world, a phrase that wouldn't sound out of place in a United Nations charter. His insistence on religious tolerance feels startlingly contemporary. All sects deserve reverence, declared one inscription, a principle mirrored in constitutions worldwide. Even his ecological mandates, like planting medicinal herbs along roadsides, prefigure today's public health initiatives. Yet Ashoka's legacy isn't without contradictions. His pacifism came after brutal conquest, raising uncomfortable questions. Can a ruler truly atone for violence, or does power always leave stains? Some scholars argue his later policies were less about enlightenment than control, using Buddhism's moral framework to unify a fractious empire. Others see genuine transformation, proof that leaders can evolve beyond their worst instincts. This tension makes him endlessly relevant. In an era where drone strikes and sanctions coexist with humanitarian aid, Ashoka's life forces us to ask, is any nation's peace truly peaceful? The most striking testament to his influence lies in India's national symbols. The Ashoka chakra, a 24-spoked wheel from his Sarnath pillar, sits at the center of the country's flag. The lion capital that once topped his edicts now graces official documents and currency. These aren't just historical nods, they're silent arguments that governance should aspire to something higher than force. When Nelson Mandela spoke of reconciliation over revenge, or when modern activists cite ahimsa, non-violence, as their shield, they're speaking Ashoka's language. His stones still speak not just of the past, but of the future we're still struggling to build. Cyrus the Great didn't just build an empire, he redefined what an empire could be. At a time when conquerors like Assyria's rulers boasted of stacking enemy skulls like bricks, Cyrus took the opposite approach when he marched into Babylon in 539 B. See, there were no mass executions, no temples reduced to rubble. Instead, he did something revolutionary. He knelt in respect before the city's patron god Marduk, freed political prisoners, and even funded the rebuilding of temples for the very people he'd just defeated. This wasn't weakness, it was a masterclass in psychological conquest. Why waste resources crushing resistance when you could turn former enemies into loyal subjects? The proof of his genius survives in a humble clay artifact no bigger than a football, the Cyrus cylinder. Discovered in 1879, buried beneath Babylon's ruins, its cuneiform inscriptions shocked scholars. Here was a conqueror declaring freedom of worship, banning forced labor, and even pledging to repatriate displaced peoples. One passage stands out: "I gathered all their inhabitants and restored to them their dwellings." Compare that to other victory monuments of the era, which glorified enlisting slaughtered tribes and razed cities. The cylinder wasn't just propaganda. It was a blueprint for tolerance so ahead of its time that when the United Nations translated it in 1971, they dubbed it the first Charter of Human Rights. But Cyrus's real innovation was administrative. Where earlier empires like Assyria ruled through terror, leaving smoldering rebellions in their wake, Persia became the world's first superpower by embracing diversity. Conquered lands kept their local governments, religions, and customs. They just paid taxes to Persia and provided soldiers when needed. Take the Jews exiled in Babylon. Cyrus not only let 40,000 return to Jerusalem, but funded the rebuilding of their temple. The biblical book of Ezra calls him the Lord's Anointed, a staggering endorsement from a people who'd suffered under previous empires. This wasn't charity, it was strategic brilliance. By positioning himself as a liberator rather than a tyrant, Cyrus turned potential insurgents into enthusiastic supporters. his military tactics were equally unconventional. The Persian army absorbed the best warriors from every conquered nation, Medes with their deadly cavalry, Babylonians with siege engines, Greek mercenaries with phalanx tactics. Instead of forcing homogeneity, Cyrus celebrated each group's strengths, creating a multicultural fighting force that dominated for centuries. Even his capital, Pasargadae, reflected this philosophy. Its gardens blended Assyrian irrigation with Egyptian column designs and Median stonework, a physical manifesto of unity through diversity. Yet the greatest testament to Cyrus's legacy isn't in ruins or artifacts, it's in the stubborn persistence of his ideals. When Alexander the Great burned Persepolis 2 centuries later, he spared Cyrus's tomb, leaving gifts instead. Why destroy what you hope to emulate? From Roman emperors to America's founding fathers, leaders have invoked Cyrus as the model of enlightened rule. His cylinders, principles, religious freedom, racial equality, the right to self-determination still echo in modern constitutions. Not bad for a king whose empire began as a scattered collection of nomadic tribes. Cyrus proved that real power isn't just about territory, it's about the stories people tell about you long after your throne turns to dust. For centuries, the location of Cyrus the Great's tomb was more than a historical mystery, it was a political battleground. The Persian king's final resting place, described by Greek historians as a modest but elegant structure in Pasargadae, stood undisturbed for millennia, revered even by later conquerors like Alexander the Great. Yet when British archaeologist James Moria stumbled upon its crumbling remains in 1812, the discovery sparked a debate that still rages today. The simple limestone structure, rising from the plains of modern-day Iran, bears no inscriptions confirming its occupant, leaving scholars to rely on ancient accounts and architectural clues. Pasargadae's design speaks volumes. Unlike the towering pyramids of Egypt or the lavish tombs of Assyrian kings, Cyrus chose restraint. A 6-tiered stone platform topped by a single-chambered sanctuary barely 30 feet high. Greek historian Arrian wrote that Alexander found it looted but intact with a golden sarcophagus, a table set with sacred vessels, and an inscription reading, "O man, whoever you are, know that I am Cyrus who gave the Persians their empire." That plaque is long gone, likely melted down by invaders, but the tomb's survival is itself remarkable. Islamic conquerors, Mongol hordes, even colonial powers left it standing, as if respecting the aura of the man who reshaped the ancient world. The real controversy lies in what the tomb reveals or obscures about Cyrus's faith. Was he a Zoroastrian, as many assume? The religion's founder, Zarathustra, likely lived centuries earlier, and Cyrus's cylinder speaks of Marduk, not Ahura Mazda. Yet the tomb's orientation aligns precisely with the sunrise during the spring equinox, a sacred moment in Zoroastrian tradition. Some scholars argue this proves nothing Persian astronomy was sophisticated enough to track celestial events for practical reasons. Others point to the tomb's lack of grave goods, suggesting exposure of the dead to scavenging birds, a Zoroastrian burial custom. The truth may be that Cyrus, ever the pragmatist, blended elements of different beliefs to unify his multicultural empire. Modern politics have further complicated the tomb's legacy. When the last Shah of Iran visited in 1971 to celebrate 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, he knelt before the empty chamber in a staged spectacle of continuity, only to be toppled by revolution 8 years later. The Islamic Republic initially dismissed Pasargadae as a relic of pagan kings, but by the 1990s it had embraced Cyrus as a nationalist symbol, restoring the site and hosting state-sanctioned celebrations. Today, the tomb sits at the crossroads of history and ideology, a silent witness to how civilizations repurpose their past. Perhaps that's Cyrus's final lesson. Even in death, he refuses to be pinned down. His grave offers no definitive answers, only possibilities, much like the empire he built, which thrived on ambiguity and adaptation. The stones whisper of a leader who understood that legacy isn't just about what you leave behind, but how others choose to remember you. And in that sense, Cyrus's tomb isn't empty at all. It's filled with the echoes of every empire that came after, still trying to measure up. Imagine a kingdom fractured by centuries of war, where 7 rival states clashed endlessly, until one ruthless visionary decided to rewrite history. Qin Shi Huang didn't just conquer China, he forged it into a single entity for the first time, stitching together warring factions with a combination of military genius and chilling efficiency. By the time he declared himself China's first emperor in 221 B.C., his ambition had already reshaped the landscape literally. His standardization policies didn't just unify weights and measures, they reshaped thought itself, imposing a single script, currency, and even axle width across millions of people. This wasn't merely administration, it was cultural engineering on an unprecedented scale. But Qin's most infamous legacy lies underground. The terracotta army, discovered by farmers in 1974, remains one of archaeology's most electrifying finds. Over 8,000 life-sized soldiers, each with unique facial features, stand guard in meticulously arranged battle formations near his tomb. The sheer scale is staggering, pit after pit filled not just with warriors but chariots, weapons, even acrobats and bureaucrats, all crafted to serve him in the afterlife. Recent excavations reveal the figures were originally painted in vivid colors, deep purples, greens, and reds, making their silent ranks even more haunting when first buried. What's often overlooked is the logistical miracle behind them. Artisans from across China worked in assembly line fashion, stamping clay tiles with workshop marks that functioned like ancient quality control tags. This wasn't just art, it was industrialized mass production 2 millennia before the factory age. His darker innovations cast long shadows. The burning of books and burying of scholars wasn't just propaganda, it was a systematic purge of dissent. Confucian texts were torched to erase competing philosophies, while hundreds of intellectuals were allegedly buried alive for resisting his ideology. Yet even this brutality had a twisted logic. Qin believed unity required uniformity, that a fractured past must be erased to create a cohesive future. His Great Wall, built by connecting existing fortifications, embodied this mentality, a physical barrier against outsiders, yes, but also a psychological one, defining China as something separate and inviolable. Paradoxically, the man who sought eternal life died from mercury poisoning, having consumed elixirs laced with the toxic metal. His tomb remains unopened, with ancient texts warning of rivers of mercury and booby traps, a puzzle modern archaeologists approach with equal parts caution and fascination. Qin Shi Huang's legacy is a riddle wrapped in terracotta and ambition, a tyrant who erased cultures yet birthed a civilization, a megalomaniac whose brutal efficiency somehow laid the groundwork for China's enduring identity. Love him or loathe him, his fingerprints are everywhere, from the characters you're reading right now to the very idea that a fractured land could become one. Qin Shi Huang's hunger for eternal life wasn't just a passing fancy, it was an all-consuming obsession that shaped his reign and ultimately sealed his fate. While other rulers built monuments to outlast them, he sought something far more audacious, to cheat death itself. Ancient texts describe a palace thick with alchemists brewing potions, their workshops filled with rare minerals and crushed jewels believed to hold the secret to immortality. The irony, these very elixirs likely hastened his demise. Mercury, a key ingredient in his life-prolonging tonics, left traces in his tomb so concentrated that soil tests near his burial mound still show toxic levels today. Imagine the scene, the most powerful man in China, surrounded by physicians and mystics, unknowingly poisoning himself sip by sip in pursuit of the impossible. His tomb complex, still mostly unexcavated, is a testament to this paradox. Historical accounts describe rivers of mercury mimicking China's great waterways, mechanical crossbows rigged to kill intruders, and a ceiling jeweled with constellations. A microcosm of the empire he ruled in life, now frozen for eternity. Modern technology has given us glimpses of the secrets beneath. Ground-penetrating radar reveals a vast underground palace with booby-trapped passageways, while mercury levels in the soil align eerily with ancient maps of China's rivers. This wasn't just a burial chamber, it was a meticulously designed afterlife kingdom, complete with terracotta bureaucrats to manage his eternal rule. The parallels to modern authoritarianism are unsettling. Qin's standardization campaigns burning books, executing dissenting scholars, rewriting history echo tactics still used today. His insistence on a single approved script foreshadows modern censorship, while his network of spies and informants mirrors surveillance states. But here's the chilling difference. Where modern strongmen manipulate media, Qin sought to erase competing ideologies entirely, leaving only his approved version of truth. Even his terracotta army, often celebrated as an artistic marvel, carries a darker subtext: thousands of identical soldiers, their individuality erased in service to absolute control. Yet for all his brutality, Qin's legacy is a study in contradictions. The same man who ordered intellectuals buried alive also created the administrative framework that stabilized China for millennia. His obsession with immortality birthed innovation, standardized writing, unified infrastructure that outlasted his dynasty. Perhaps that's the ultimate irony. In trying to escape death, Qin became something far more powerful than just a man. He became an idea, a cautionary tale about the price of absolute power, and a reminder that even the mightiest rulers can't control how history remembers them. Alexander the Great stormed into history like a thunderbolt, a king who conquered half the known world before most modern people even finish graduate school. By 32, he'd trampled the mighty Persian Empire, marched his army to the edge of India, and forged a realm stretching from Greece to the Himalayas. But what set Alexander apart wasn't just his military genius, it was his radical vision for blending cultures. Where other conquerors imposed their customs, he embraced local traditions, marrying Persian princesses, adopting foreign dress, and even forcing his generals to take Asian wives. This wasn't just politics, it was a cultural revolution disguised as conquest. His battlefield tactics remained textbook material. At Gorgaimla, facing a Persian force 5 times larger, Alexander lured King Darius into overextending his lines, then spearheaded a cavalry charge straight at the enemy commander, a move so audacious it shattered Persian morale in hours. He didn't just win battles, he rewrote the rules of war, using feigned retreats, night marches, and psychological warfare centuries before these became standard. Yet his true brilliance lay in logistics. Keeping an army supplied across 10,000 miles of deserts and mountains required innovations like prefabricated pontoon bridges and mobile siege engines that could be dismantled and carried by mules. But Alexander's most lasting legacy wasn't territory, it was the Hellenistic world he created. When he torched Persepolis, it wasn't mindless destruction, it was symbolism, the old order giving way to his new cosmopolitan vision. He founded over 70 cities, from Egypt's Alexandria to Afghanistan's Ai Khanum, seeding Greek art, philosophy, and science across continents. These weren't military outposts but cultural hubs where Greek sculptors worked alongside Babylonian astronomers and Indian mathematicians. The famous Library of Alexandria, that was Alexander's indirect doing, a melting pot of global knowledge made possible by his deliberate dismantling of cultural barriers. His death in Babylon remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The official story, a fever after a drinking binge, doesn't square with accounts of his symptoms, escalating pain, paralysis, and a voice lost days before the end. Poison seems plausible given the bitter infighting among his generals, but ancient texts tantalize with other possibilities. Was it malaria from Mesopotamia's swamps, typhoid from contaminated water, or, as some scholars speculate, a neurological disorder like Guillain-Barré syndrome, which could explain his gradual paralysis. The truth died with him in that humid palace room, leaving centuries of speculation in its wake. Alexander's empire fractured almost immediately after his death, but his influence proved indelible. The Buddha statues of Gandhara blend Greek realism with Eastern spirituality, direct fruits of his cultural fusion. The New Testament was written in Greek because of the linguistic unity he created. Even his failures became lessons. Later conquerors from Caesar to Napoleon studied his campaigns, learning both what to emulate and what to avoid. In the end, Alexander's greatest conquest wasn't land. It was the human imagination, proving that a single life, however brief, could bend the arc of civilization forever. Alexander's sudden death at 32 didn't just create a power vacuum, it ignited a firestorm of ambition among his generals, each scrambling to carve their own kingdom from the empire's smoldering remains. The so-called wars of the Diadochi weren't just battles. They were a 40-year maelstrom of shifting alliances, poisoned feasts, and shattered friendships that redrew the map of the ancient world. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most cunning commanders, played the long game, securing Egypt as his power base while others wasted strength fighting over Babylon and Persia. His masterstroke, hijacking Alexander's funeral procession and diverting the golden hearse to Memphis, then Alexandria, a symbolic coup that tied his legitimacy to the conqueror's corpse. This brutal game of thrones birthed unexpected cultural legacies. Ptolemy's descendants ruling from Alexandria transformed Egypt into the Mediterranean's intellectual powerhouse. The Library of Alexandria, with its 500,000 scrolls, became the ancient equivalent of the Internet thanks to a dynasty obsessed with outshining rivals through knowledge rather than just conquest. But here's the twist. Ptolemaic Egypt's most famous artifact, the Rosetta Stone, owes its existence to this very instability, carved in 196 B. C. To placate rebellious priests, this slab of black basalt recorded a decree in 3 scripts: Greek, hieroglyphics, and Demotic Egyptian. When Napoleon's soldiers unearthed it 2 millennia later, it became the key to deciphering hieroglyphs, cracking open ancient Egypt's secrets. The stone wasn't just administrative paperwork, it was a propaganda tool from a Greek dynasty desperate to prove they belonged in Pharaoh's clothing. Alexander's mythos grew wilder in death than in life. Within decades, legends sprouted that he'd ascended to heaven in a celestial chariot or explored the ocean's depths in a glass diving bell. The Alexander Romance, a medieval bestseller, depicted him as everything from an alchemist to a proto-Christian saint. Even his body became a political relic. Ptolemy's successors displayed it in a gold and glass sarcophagus, charging visitors for glimpses. Roman emperors from Augustus to Caracalla made pilgrimages to Alexandria to commune with his spirit, pilfering his armor for battles or weeping at his tomb like starstruck fans. The most enduring legacy of the successor wars, they proved Alexander's vision couldn't be contained by mortal rulers. His empire fragmented but Hellenistic culture, that vibrant blend of Greek, Persian, and local traditions became the ancient world's operating system. From Buddha statues with Apollo's features in Afghanistan to Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek in Alexandria, his accidental cultural revolution outlasted every squabbling general. The irony is delicious. The man who chased immortality through conquest achieved it through chaos, his name echoing not as a mere king, but as an idea too powerful for any successor to bury. The name Cleopatra conjures images of a seductive queen lounging on golden couches, her beauty so mesmerizing it brought Rome to its knees, but history tells a far more fascinating story. Far from the Hollywood caricature, Cleopatra VII was a polyglot diplomat who spoke 9 languages, including Ethiopian, Hebrew, and the obscure tongue of Egypt's ancient troglodytes. When she first met Julius Caesar, she didn't arrive rolled in a rug just to dazzle him. It was a calculated move to bypass her brother's assassins. This wasn't romance, it was realpolitik, the act of a ruler who understood that survival meant making powerful friends in a world where Rome's shadow grew longer every day. Her true genius lay in balancing two competing realities, preserving Egypt's independence while accommodating Rome's insatiable appetite for dominance. Take her legendary rendezvous with Mark Antony at Tarsus. Plutarch describes her arrival on a golden barge with perfumed sails, but the spectacle wasn't mere pageantry, it was psychological warfare. By presenting herself as Isis incarnate, flanked by servants dressed as cupids, she reframed their meeting from a subordinate's plea to a goddess gracing a mortal. Antony, already wrestling with rivals in Rome, couldn't afford to insult Egypt's wealth or grain supply. Cleopatra turned a potential humiliation into a partnership that would buy her kingdom another decade of autonomy. The myths surrounding her death reveal just as much about ancient propaganda as they do about her. Roman historians painted her suicide by bite as the hysterical act of a scorned woman, but consider the context. Octavian had trapped her in Alexandria, her fleet betrayed, her children's futures hanging by a thread. A public execution in Rome was inevitable, a fate no Ptolemy could endure. By choosing death on her own terms, Cleopatra denied Octavian his triumphant spectacle. The asp, sacred to the sun god Ra, transformed her end into a final act of sovereignty. Even in defeat, she controlled the narrative. Modern archaeology dismantles more Hollywood falsehoods. Coins minted during her reign show a woman with a prominent nose and sharp jawline striking, but hardly the vamp of legend. The real allure was her mind. She was the first Ptolemy in 3 centuries to fluently speak Egyptian, earning loyalty from priests by restoring temples and positioning herself as the reincarnation of Isis. When famine struck, she opened royal granaries, not out of altruism but because she knew bread riots could topple dynasties. Every gesture, from her religious patronage to her strategic motherhood, bearing sons to both Caesar and Antony as living treaties, was a thread in the tapestry of her rule. Cleopatra's legacy isn't just about what she did, but what she represented, the last gasp of a dying world order. When Octavian annexed Egypt, he didn't just defeat a queen, he extinguished 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. Yet even in death, she outmaneuvered him. By immortalizing her as a decadent temptress, Roman poets inadvertently cemented her place in history. The woman who navigated civil wars, managed a kingdom's economy, and negotiated with empires as an equal was reduced to a cautionary tale about feminine wiles, proof that when history is written by the victors, the truth often hides in the margins, waiting to be rediscovered. Beneath the turquoise waters of Alexandria's harbor lies a sunken world where Cleopatra's palace once stood, a silent kingdom of shattered marble and drowned statues that whispers secrets about her final days. For centuries, historians assumed these ruins were lost forever, swallowed by earthquakes and rising seas. But underwater archaeologist Frank Godio's team proved otherwise. Using advanced sonar and painstaking dives, they mapped a sprawling complex that once glittered with gold leaf ceilings and exotic menageries. Among the silt-covered columns and toppled sphinxes, they found something extraordinary, a granite slab inscribed with Cleopatra's name, confirming this was indeed her royal quarter. The discovery wasn't just about locating a palace, it was about piecing together the desperate final chapter of her rule. The harbor floor tells a story no Roman historian could. Divers recovered coins minted in Cleopatra's final year, their worn edges suggesting frantic payments to mercenaries as Octavian's forces closed in. Statues of Isis, her divine alter ego, lay deliberately toppled, likely defaced by Roman soldiers erasing her cult. Most haunting are the personal artifacts. A carved amethyst scarab, its purple stone favored by Egyptian royalty for protection, and delicate glass perfume bottles that might have held the famous Kaif Plutarch described wafting from her robes. These aren't just treasures, they're time capsules from the last days of a queen who knew her world was ending. recent dives revealed an even darker clue, a network of submerged tunnels beneath the palace, their walls scorched. Archaeologists speculate these were escape routes or hidden armories torched during Octavian's invasion. One tunnel leads toward the supposed site of Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she allegedly stored her treasures to deny them to Rome. The irony is palpable. The same waters that preserved her palace also hid the truth about her death. Roman accounts claim she died in her chambers, but what if her final moments played out in these underground passages? The most compelling evidence comes not from grand halls, but from a modest workshop near the docks. Here, conservators found lead ingots stamped with Mark Antony's name, proof of his desperate naval preparations before the Battle of Actium. Mixed among them were Egyptian glass ingots, revealing a doomed alliance's industrial backbone. These mundane objects scream louder than any propaganda. Cleopatra and Antony weren't just lovers playing at war, they were sovereigns marshalling every resource to stave off oblivion. As sediment shifts with each tide, so does our understanding. In 2022, sonar detected an anomaly near the palace, a rectangular structure buried deep in the harbor mud. Some believe it could be the long-lost tomb where Cleopatra and Antony were briefly interred before Rome ordered their remains hidden. Whether that mystery is ever solved, the seafloor has already rewritten history. The woman reduced to a seductress in Roman texts emerges from these ruins as a strategist fighting to save a civilization. Her palace's drowned stones testifying to a reign that was anything but frivolous. The Mediterranean may have claimed her world, but archaeology is giving it back, one fragment at a time. Julius Caesar understood something most Roman senators refused to admit. Power didn't flow from dusty scrolls or ancient traditions, but from the roar of the crowd. When he swept into Rome after conquering Gaul, he didn't just bring legions, he brought a radical blueprint for reform that would unravel the Republic's ossified elite. Debt relief for struggling citizens, free grain distributions, even public works employing thousands. These weren't handouts, but calculated strikes at the aristocracy's economic stranglehold. His most audacious move, packing the Senate with outsiders, merchants, provincial elites, even freed slaves, shattering the old family's monopoly on governance. To the patricians sipping wine on their estates, this wasn't progress, it was revolution. The Rubicon crossing wasn't just a river crossed, it was a line erased. When Caesar paused on its banks in 49 B.C., he wasn't merely defying Senate orders, he was exposing the Republic's hypocrisy. Rome's laws forbade generals from entering Italy with armies, but those same laws had been bent for decades to favor the wealthy. As his legion's boots churned the shallows, Caesar flipped a coin to a fisherman who'd guided them, a tiny act of theater that said everything. This wasn't just war, it was performance, demonstrating that real authority came from loyalty, not legality. By dawn, Rome's elite were fleeing in panic, their vaunted institutions crumbling before one man's audacity. Yet for all his brilliance, Caesar's downfall came from failing to see how deeply fear had rooted among his peers. When 60 senators stabbed him 23 times on the Ides of March, they weren't just killing a man, they were trying to resurrect a system already beyond saving. The assassination backfired spectacularly. Instead of restoring the Republic, it unleashed chaos, proving Caesar had been the glue holding Rome together. The people whose lives he'd improved turned on the conspirators, burning the Forum in rage. Within years, his adopted heir Octavian would leverage that populist fury to cement imperial rule, turning Caesar's name into a title that emperors would wear like a crown. Ironically, Caesar's greatest legacy wasn't his military conquests or even his reforms, it was the dangerous precedent he set. By proving one man could bend the Republic to his will, he unwittingly wrote the playbook for every dictator who followed, from Napoleon to modern strongmen. The eerie parallels resonate today. The use of economic crises to bypass legislatures, the cult of personality built through public spectacles, even the way his enemies' attempts to stop him only accelerated the change they feared. His life and death taught the world a brutal lesson. When institutions grow brittle enough, sometimes it takes just one person to push, and the whole edifice comes crashing down. Caesar didn't just conquer Gaul, he weaponized storytelling to ensure Rome celebrated his victories long before he returned home. His commentaries on the Gallic War weren't dry military reports. They were masterpieces of propaganda, written in third person to feign objectivity while subtly portraying him as both brilliant general and merciful statesman. Take his account of the Battle of Alesia. He dramatized his troops' exhaustion, the overwhelming Gallic numbers, and his own tactical genius, ignoring the fact that his siege tactics bordered on war crimes. These dispatches, read aloud in Rome's forums, weren't just news. They were a serialized epic with Caesar as the invincible hero, shaping public perception battle by battle. Then there were the coins. Roman currency wasn't just money, it was mass media, circulating farther and faster than any scroll. Caesar minted denarii stamped with his profile, a shocking break from tradition. Before him, living Romans rarely appeared on coins. Now his stern face and the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, jingled in every merchant's purse. Some bore images of Venus, his divine ancestor, or trophies from Gaul, blending military glory with religious legitimacy. These weren't subtle messages. They were visual memes, reinforcing his authority with every transaction from Britannia to Egypt. The parallels to modern political branding are uncanny. Caesar's calculated reluctance to accept the crown from Mark Antony during the Lupercalia festival staged before a crowd mirrors today's viral political theater. His populist reforms, like redistributing land to veterans, played directly to his base, much like modern campaign promises targeting key demographics. Even his assassination backfired in a way that feels eerily contemporary. The conspirators, smugly calling themselves liberators, misread the public mood. Romans didn't cheer their freedom. They rioted, burning the senators' homes and deifying Caesar posthumously, proof that manufactured narratives can outlive even their creators. Yet Caesar's propaganda had a flaw his modern successors should heed: overreach. By placing his face on coins and accepting lifetime titles, he alienated elites who saw monarchy as tyranny. Today's leaders still grapple with this balance, building a cult of personality strong enough to inspire loyalty, but not so blatant it triggers backlash. The lesson: imagecraft might win battles, but without institutional support, even the most brilliant branding can't stop a knife in the Senate House. Caesar's story warns us: control the narrative, but never let the crowd see you pulling the strings. Augustus didn't just inherit Rome, he reinvented it, and himself along the way. The man born Octavian was a master of political theater, transforming from a vengeful young warlord into the serene first citizen, with such skill that historians still debate where the act ended and the real man began. After the bloody purges of his early reign, he realized brute force alone wouldn't heal Rome's divisions, so he staged a brilliant performance in 27 B.C., standing before the Senate and theatrically resigning his emergency powers, knowing full well they'd beg him to stay. The title they offered wasn't king, but Augustus, meaning the revered one, a carefully crafted compromise that let him rule absolutely while maintaining the illusion of republican tradition. This wasn't just image control, it was institutional alchemy. Where Julius Caesar flaunted his power, Augustus draped his immodesty. He refused golden thrones, wore homespun robes, and called himself merely princeps, first among equals. Yet behind the scenes, he held command of every legion, controlled the grain supply, and appointed key magistrates. The genius was in the balance. By preserving the Senate's ceremonial role, he gave the aristocracy enough dignity to accept his rule. Even his residence on Rome's Palatine Hill, though modest by dictator standards, became so synonymous with power that palace derives from its name. The Pax Romana, the 2-century peace he ushered in, wasn't just the absence of war, it was an empire operating at peak efficiency. Roads stretched like arteries from Scotland to Syria, their milestones bearing his name. A professional civil service replaced corrupt tax collectors, while a standing navy cleared Mediterranean pirates from trade routes. Rome itself transformed from a city of brick to marble, with Augustus boasting he'd found it built of sun-dried clay and left it clothed in stone. The arts flourished under patronage, with Virgil composing the Aeneid as propaganda, casting Augustus as the destined heir to Aeneas's divine legacy. His final words were pure enigma. According to Suetonius, Augustus turned to his attendants and asked, "Did I play my part well in the comedy of life?" Then, with typical precision, he added, "If so, applaud as I exit." Was this a deathbed confession that his entire reign had been performance art, or the last wink from a man who'd always understood power's theatrical nature? Even his successor Tiberius, arriving too late to hear the words, allegedly found Augustus already cold, one hand raised as if still gauging the crowd's reaction. The empire he built would outshine him in grandeur, but never in subtlety. Later emperors like Nero and Caligula would mistake Augustus's restraint for weakness, indulging in excesses he'd carefully avoided. Yet the system endured, proving his greatest trick wasn't conquering Rome, it was making absolute power look like humble service. The applause he requested still echoes through history, not for the actor, but for the stage he built, an empire that would dominate the Western world for 500 years. Augustus didn't rule through fear, he mastered something far more enduring: obligation. Beneath Rome's marble facades and Senate decrees, an invisible web of favors and loyalties held his empire together. This was the patron-client system, an ancient version of political networking where power flowed not just from titles, but from who owed whom. Imagine a newly conquered provincial governor arriving in Rome. Augustus wouldn't threaten him, he'd grant land, sponsor his son's education, or secure a profitable trade route. The message was clear: prosperity came through loyalty, not rebellion. Soon, elites across the empire competed to prove their devotion, binding their fates to his. The genius was in its reciprocity. When Augustus rebuilt neighborhoods after fires, he didn't just earn gratitude, he created dependencies. Artisans employed in his construction projects became his informal eyes and ears. Wealthy freedmen given lucrative tax collection contracts policed commerce for him. Even poets like Horace, who once fought against him, became vocal supporters after receiving a countryside estate. These weren't bribes, they were investments in a self-sustaining system where every gift created indebtedness. The poet Ovid learned this the hard way when exile followed his scandalous Ars Amatoria, a stark reminder that imperial favors could be revoked. Military loyalty followed the same blueprint. By centralizing legion pay under his control, Augustus turned soldiers into personal clients. Veterans received farmland not from the state, but from the generosity of Caesar, ensuring their allegiance bypassed the Senate entirely. Provincial towns vied to host retired legionaries, knowing these battle-hardened men would report disloyal whispers back to Rome. The Praetorian Guard, ostensibly protectors of the state, became his private army, their lavish barracks a stone's throw from his home. Yet the system's true brilliance lay in its deniability. When rebellions flickered in the provinces, local elites often crushed them preemptively, not because of imperial orders, but to protect their privileged positions within Augustus's network. By the time a crisis reached his desk, loyal clients had usually handled it. This shadow governance allowed him to pose as a reluctant ruler while pulling every string. The lesson echoes through modern corridors of power. From political machines to corporate alliances, the patron-client framework persists wherever influence matters more than titles. Augustus proved that real control isn't just about who obeys you, it's about who feels they can't afford to disobey. His reign set the template for empire not through legions alone, but through the quiet, calculated exchange of favors that turned rivals into stakeholders. The marble monuments have crumbled, but the art of transactional loyalty still defines how power works. Boudicca's rebellion wasn't just a revolt, it was a wildfire of vengeance that scorched Roman Britain to its foundations. The Celtic queen's story reaches us through three fractured lenses: the oral traditions of her Iceni tribe, the venomous graffiti left by Roman settlers, and the grudging admiration of historians like Tacitus, who framed her as both savage and tragic. Each version tells a different truth. To the Britons, she was a mother turned avenging fury after Roman soldiers flogged her and raped her daughters, a violation meant to humiliate the Iceni into submission. But Tacitus, writing decades later for a Roman audience, couldn't resist painting her as a barbaric spectacle, a towering figure with flame-red hair, rallying tribes with promises of plunder and freedom. The truth likely lay somewhere between myth and imperial propaganda. Archaeology fills in the gaps Tacitus ignored. In 2005, a team excavating near Colchester uncovered a charred layer of earth packed with Celtic coins and broken Roman statues, traces of Boudicca's first target. The city had been a thriving Roman veteran colony until her forces reduced it to ash. Crucially, they found children's bones mixed with military debris, suggesting families were caught in the onslaught. This wasn't just warfare, it was erasure. Her next strike, Londinium, left similar scars, blackened debris under modern London's financial district, where a melted Roman shop sign still bears witness to temperatures hot enough to warp bronze. The rebellion's climax at Watling Street reveals Rome's cold military calculus. Outnumbered but disciplined, Governor Suetonius Paulinus positioned his legions in a narrow defile, neutralizing Boudicca's advantage in numbers. Tacitus claims she rode among her troops in a chariot with her daughters, hurling curses, but Celtic folklore remembers her final speech differently, not as a battle cry but a lament. Win or die, she allegedly told her people, "That is what I, a woman, will do." The aftermath was slaughter. Roman cavalry trapped the Britons against their own supply wagons, cutting down tens of thousands. Boudicca's fate is shrouded. Tacitus says she poisoned herself. Celtic bards whisper she wandered into the mists, destined to return when Britain needed her. Modern revisitations of her legacy reveal uncomfortable nuances. Yes, she massacred civilians, but so did Rome routinely. Her uprising briefly united fractious tribes under a shared purpose, something no Roman diplomacy had achieved. And while Tacitus portrayed her as an exception to feminine weakness, Celtic society had long accepted warrior queens. The real shock wasn't that a woman led armies, but that she nearly won. Today, a statue of Boudicca stands near Westminster, her chariot wheels forever suspended in motion. It's a fitting tribute to a leader who refused to be forgotten, whether as a barbarian, a martyr, or something far more compelling, a woman who forced history to remember her name. Boudicca's fiery legacy didn't fade with the ashes of Londinium. It smoldered for centuries before roaring back to life in the modern era. The Victorian age, obsessed with empire and morality, resurrected her as a contradictory icon, a barbarian queen polished into a nationalist symbol. Painters like Thomas Thornycroft depicted her as a regal warrior, standing tall in her chariot, spear raised a far cry from Tacitus's Scourge of Rome. This wasn't just artistic license, it was propaganda. As Britain expanded its own empire, Boudicca became a convenient parallel, her rebellion reframed as a noble struggle against foreign oppression. The irony is thick enough to taste. A woman who burned colonial settlements was now the mascot of a colonial superpower. Feminist movements seized her image with even greater fervor. Suffragettes marching in the early 1900s carried banners bearing Boudicca's likeness, her defiance recast as a battle cry for gender equality. Emmeline Pankhurst, leader of the Women's Social and Political Union, explicitly linked their fight to the warrior queen's resistance, declaring, we are the daughters of Boudica. The parallels were irresistible, a woman brutalized by male authority, rising up against a system designed to break her. Yet this interpretation glossed over uncomfortable truths. Boudica's rebellion slaughtered innocents, including women and children. The feminist reclaiming of her story reveals a deeper tension. How do we honor female rage without sanitizing its consequences? The mystery of her burial site adds another layer to the myth. At least 5 locations across Britain claim to hold her bones, from a mound near Parliament to a Norfolk field. The most tantalizing theory places her beneath Platform 10 at London's King's Cross station, where engineers in the 1850s reported uncovering a chariot and skeletal remains during construction. The story, likely apocryphal, gained fresh traction with J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, where the fictional Platform 9 3/4 slyly nods to the legend. Archaeologists remain skeptical, but the persistence of these claims speaks volumes. Boudica isn't just a historical figure. She's a cultural phantom, forever just out of reach, waiting to be rediscovered. Modern Britain still wrestles with her legacy. Statues and school curriculums celebrate her as a freedom fighter, while historians debate whether she prolonged Roman rule by provoking harsher reprisals. Celtic revivalists invoke her name in calls for Welsh and Cornish independence, while far-right groups bizarrely co-opt her as a symbol of anti-immigrant sentiment, a grotesque distortion of a leader who united diverse tribes against imperial occupation. The truth is, Boudica resists easy categorization. She was neither a flawless hero nor a mindless destroyer, but a woman pushed to extremes by a system that underestimated her. Her power lies in that ambiguity, in the way she forces every generation to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, violence, and who gets to write history. The Romans tried to erase her, the Victorians tried to tame her, and feminists tried to claim her, but Boudica, it seems, belongs to no one but herself. Chandragupta Maurya didn't just build an empire, he weaponized secrets. The founder of India's first pan-subcontinental dynasty ruled not just through armies, but through an espionage network so sophisticated it would make modern intelligence agencies blush. His playbook, the Arthashastra, a manual of statecraft written by his chief advisor Kautilya, which reads like a 4th century B.C. version of The Art of War meets Machiavelli. Among its pages lay instructions for recruiting spies from every strata of society, holy men who eavesdropped in temples, merchants who tracked troop movements, even courtesans trained to extract secrets from drunken generals. These weren't lone operatives, they were threads in a vast, invisible web where information flowed faster than chariots. One passage chillingly advises rulers to test loyalty by having spies falsely accuse officials of treason. Those who reported the plot passed, those who stayed silent were purged. Yet the same man who orchestrated this surveillance state ultimately walked away from it. After decades of ruthless expansion, Chandragupta shocked the ancient world by abdicating his throne, becoming a Jain monk, and starving himself to death in ritual Salakhana, a final renunciation of the power he'd spent his life accumulating. Greek ambassador Megasthenes, stationed at his court, left baffled accounts of the emperor's transformation. One moment, Chandragupta presided over a capital where gold vessels lined the streets during festivals. The next, he wandered barefoot, begging for alms. This wasn't just personal piety, it was geopolitical theater. By embracing Jainism's strict non-violence after years of conquest, he may have been signaling stability to restless provinces. Even the fiercest lion could choose peace. Megasthenes Indica offers rare glimpses of Chandragupta's court through foreign eyes. He describes a palace where mechanical birds flapped golden wings to announce the hour, and where food tasters sampled dishes for poison, a practice the Mauryans elevated to an art. More intriguing are his notes on Chandragupta's war elephants, armored beasts carrying archers in howdahs, which terrified Alexander's former generals. The Greeks had never seen elephants deployed systematically as artillery. By the time Seleucus Nicator faced them, he was so outmaneuvered he traded vast territories just for 500 of the creatures. The Mauryan capital Pataliputra stunned visitors with its engineering, wooden walls reinforced with iron plates, moats stocked with crocodiles, and a sewage system surpassing Rome's. But its true innovation was bureaucratic. Chandragupta's administration categorized everything from shipbuilding timbers to types of spies, with salaries paid in silver punch-marked coins, one of history's first standardized currencies. Tax collectors assessed fields by measuring shadows at solar noon, while census takers recorded births and deaths in real time. Chandragupta's legacy is a study in contradictions. The spy king who became an ascetic, the conqueror who institutionalized welfare systems. His empire would peak under his grandson Ashoka, but its foundations, part Arthashastra ruthlessness, part Jainist idealism, remained uniquely his. In an era when most rulers clung to power until death, Chandragupta's final lesson was the most radical. Sometimes true strength lies not in holding the throne, but in knowing when to leave it. Kautilya's Arthashastra isn't just an ancient scroll, it's a playbook for power that feels unnervingly modern. The text's chapters on espionage could pass for a CI training manual, detailing everything from honey traps to disinformation campaigns. One passage instructs rulers to deploy saints as undercover agents, holy men who blended into temples to gather intelligence while whispering propaganda into pious ears. Another recommends poisoning enemy granaries or hiring assassins disguised as chefs, proving subterfuge was as vital as swords in Chandragupta's rise. But what truly chills the spine is Kautilya's concept of Vishkanya, women trained to kill with poisoned embraces. These weren't mythical femme fatales. Historical records suggest they were real operatives, schooled in toxins and seduction, turning intimacy into a weapon centuries before Mata Hari. The Arthashastra's economic strategies are equally ruthless. Kautilya advocated for state-controlled industries, price fixing on essential goods, and even monopolies on mining, policies that wouldn't feel out of place in a modern socialist economy. His taxation system was a masterclass in extraction disguised as benevolence. Farmers surrendered 1/6 of their harvest, while spies posing as merchants ensured no one underreported. Yet he also mandated famine relief and public works, understanding that starving subjects rebel. This carrot-and-stick approach mirrors contemporary economic theories where welfare and surveillance often go hand in hand. Comparisons to Machiavelli's The Prince are inevitable but incomplete. Where Machiavelli wrote for a single ruler's survival, Kautilya engineered an entire system: bureaucracies, trade networks, even environmental regulations. His chapters on forestry management read like modern sustainability guides, prescribing fines for illegal logging and rewards for reforestation. The Arthashastra wasn't just about conquest, it was about creating a machine so finely tuned it could run without its king, which explains how Chandragupta's empire thrived even after he renounced the throne. Scholars still debate whether Kautilya's tactics were descriptive or prescriptive. Did he document existing practices or invent them? Either way, their legacy endures. India's intelligence agencies reportedly study the Arthashastra for counterterrorism strategies, while economists cite its trade policies as early examples of globalization. The text's most haunting lesson isn't its brutality, but its pragmatism. Power isn't about morality, but equilibrium. Chandragupta's empire didn't collapse under its own ruthlessness because Kautilya understood that even the darkest strategies must be balanced with just enough light to keep the wheels turning. In that sense, the Arthashastra isn't just history, it's a mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truths about how power really works then and now. Pericles didn't just lead Athens, he redefined what a city could be. At the height of its golden age, the city pulsed with an energy unseen before in history, a place where sculptors, philosophers, and merchants thrived under the bold experiment of democracy. But this wasn't democracy as we know it today. Under Pericles, citizenship was exclusive, limited to free-born Athenian men, yet within that circle, power flowed directly from the people. Every decision, from war to public works, was debated in the open air of the Pnyx, a hillside assembly where thousands could vote by raised hands. The system was messy, chaotic, and utterly revolutionary. The Parthenon stands as the ultimate symbol of Pericles' vision, not just a temple to Athena, but a declaration of Athenian supremacy. Built with funds diverted from the Delian League, an alliance meant to defend against Persia, its construction was as much political as it was artistic. The sculptor Phidias bent optical illusions into its marble columns, making them appear perfectly straight by curving them slightly inward. Every detail, from the friezes depicting Athenian myths to the golden statue of Athena inside, reinforced one message: Athens wasn't just a city, it was a beacon of civilization. Yet beneath the grandeur lay a calculated move. By employing thousands of laborers, Pericles ensured the working class had a stake in the empire's glory, turning art into a tool of social cohesion. His funeral oration, delivered during the Peloponnesian War, remains one of history's most stirring speeches. Thucydides' record of it immortalizes a moment when Pericles framed Athenian democracy as a radical act of trust. We alone consider a man who takes no interest in public affairs not as harmless but as useless, he declared, elevating civic duty to a moral imperative. The speech celebrated sacrifice, yes, but its deeper brilliance was in making that sacrifice feel voluntary rather than coerced. By tying personal worth to communal contribution, Pericles transformed obligation into pride, a psychological masterstroke that kept Athenians fighting for a dwindling cause even as plague ravaged their city. The darker side of his leadership often gets glossed over. That same Delian League treasury funding the Parthenon, it was essentially extorted from allied cities, their contributions enforced by Athenian warships. His strategy against Sparta, pulling citizens behind the long walls while abandoning the countryside, led to overcrowding and a devastating plague that killed thousands, including Pericles himself. Critics argue his imperial ambitions sowed the seeds of Athens' eventual defeat, proving that even the most enlightened leadership can't outrun hubris. Yet his legacy transcends marble and military missteps. Pericles proved that a society could elevate collective ambition over individual tyranny, that beauty and power weren't mutually exclusive. When modern democracies debate civic engagement or public arts funding, they're walking paths he first carved. The Parthenon's ruins still gleam under the Attic sun, but his true monument is the enduring idea they represent, that a city's greatness is measured not by the gold in its temples, but by the voices in its assembly. Pericles faced a crisis no leader could rehearse: a plague creeping through Athens' overcrowded streets, killing 1 in 3 citizens, rattling the very foundations of his golden age. As the Peloponnesian War raged outside the long walls, his strategy of concentrating the population within the city's defenses turned lethal. The disease, likely typhus or smallpox, didn't discriminate between general and grocer, melting flesh and morale alike. Yet what's striking isn't just the suffering, it's how Athenian democracy responded under pressure. Pericles, usually a master of oratory, found words failing him as bodies piled up in the agora. No grand speeches could mask the stench of decay or the cracks in his leadership. Modern epidemiologists would recognize Athens' plight instantly: overwhelmed hospitals, mass graves, and a society fraying at the edges. Thucydides, who survived the plague, wrote of citizens abandoning laws, hoarding supplies, and chasing reckless pleasures, anticipating every pandemic's psychological toll by millennia. The parallels to 2020 are eerie. Like leaders 2,000 years later, Pericles grappled with impossible choices. Evacuate the countryside to deny Sparta resources but risk overcrowding, keep assemblies open to sustain democracy, or close them to slow the spread. His calculus favored military necessity over public health, a trade-off that haunts modern debates about lockdowns versus economic survival. Yet the contrasts with contemporary leadership reveal just how much and how little has changed. Where today's governments deploy testing and vaccines, Pericles had only prayers and desperate remedies. No scientific advisors briefed him on flattening curves. Priests scrutinized entrails instead of infection rates. But one Athenian instinct feels painfully familiar: the search for scapegoats. As deaths mounted, rumors spread that rival Sparta had poisoned wells, a precursor to modern conspiracy theories targeting foreign powers. The big difference: Pericles himself fell ill, experiencing the plague's horrors firsthand before succumbing in 429 B.C. Few modern leaders have faced their policies' consequences so directly. The plague's aftermath unraveled Pericles' carefully constructed society. Faith in the gods wavered, laws lost their force, and a generation of artists and thinkers perished. The Golden Age didn't so much end as dissolve into cynicism and infighting. There's a sobering lesson here: no amount of Parthenons or philosophical triumphs can inoculate a civilization against existential shocks. Today's leaders study Pericles for his triumphs, but his greatest legacy might be this cautionary tale. Visionary leadership thrives in sunshine, but true mettle is tested when the air itself turns toxic, and every decision, however reasoned, breeds unintended suffering. The plague didn't just kill Athenians, it exposed the fragility of even the most enlightened systems when nature refuses to follow human scripts. Ramses II didn't just rule Egypt, he rewrote reality itself. The Battle of Kadesh should have been his greatest humiliation. Trapped in a near defeat against the Hittites, his forces scattered, his life hanging by a thread. Yet temple walls across Egypt tell a different story, one where Ramses, alone and godlike, charges into enemy ranks, turning certain disaster into glorious victory. These carvings aren't history, they're ancient Photoshop, a masterclass in spin doctoring, the real stroke of genius, admitting just enough failure to make the tale believable. Inscriptions acknowledge his army's panic, framing his solo stand as divine intervention. The takeaway wasn't Ramses never struggles, but Ramses triumphs despite all odds, a narrative so potent that Egyptologists spent centuries taking it at face value. Then there's Abu Simbel, a monument to ego so vast it was literally moved to save it from modernity. Carved into cliffs above the Nile, its 4 colossal statues of Ramses gaze eternally southward, a silent warning to Nubia: this land belongs to Pharaoh. But in the 1960s, as rising waters from the Aswan Dam threatened to drown the temples, engineers dismantled them block by block, relocating the entire complex 200 meters higher. The operation took 4 years and involved slicing the mountain into over 1,000 pieces, each meticulously reassembled. The irony: Ramses built Abu Simbel to last forever, yet it took 20th century technology to fulfill that promise. His face still stares across the lake, but now it's tourists, not conquered subjects, who kneel before it. 66 years on the throne reshaped Egypt in ways even Ramses couldn't predict. By outliving 12 crown princes, he created a crisis of succession that destabilized the dynasty. Yet his longevity also allowed unprecedented projects: the Ramesseum, Pi Ramesses, countless obelisks, each stamped with his name so often that later pharaohs literally recycled his statues rather than carve new ones. The side effect: a cultural stagnation, with one man dominating art, religion, and politics for 2 generations, innovation calcified into tradition. Even his mummy tells a story of excess. Examination revealed severe arthritis and dental abscesses, the price of a life stretching into his 90s, far beyond the era's average lifespan. Modern leaders could learn from Ramses' propaganda playbook. His treaties with the Hittites, preserved on clay tablets, show a pragmatism beneath the bravado: the world's first recorded peace agreement, complete with mutual defense clauses and extradition terms. The Abu Simbel relocation, meanwhile, became a blueprint for international heritage preservation. proving that even the mightiest monuments sometimes need humility to survive. Ramses understood what every great leader grasps eventually. History isn't written by the victors, it's written by those who chisel the loudest, and 33 centuries later we're still listening. Ramses II's mummy tells a story his monuments never could, one of pain, vanity, and an afterlife far stranger than he ever imagined. When researchers unrolled his bandages in 1881, they found a monarch frozen in time, his high arched nose and strong jawline still recognizable after 3 millennia. But it wasn't until modern CT scans peered beneath the linen that the full picture emerged. The pharaoh who claimed godhood suffered severe arthritis, his spine curved like an old tree, his hips eroded from decades of chariot riding. His teeth revealed abscesses deep enough to have caused constant agony, likely masked by honeyed wines and opium. These weren't just medical curiosities, they were proof that even the man who proclaimed himself Usamata Setipena, the justice of Ra is powerful, chosen of Ra, couldn't escape the frailty of age. The most surreal chapter of Ramses' postmortem saga came in 1976, when French scientists requested the mummy for preservation work. Egyptian law demanded even dead pharaohs have travel documents, so Ramses received an official passport occupation listed as king deceased. Photographs show his linen-wrapped form strapped into a first-class Air France seat, an attendant hovering nearby as if he might order ambrosia mid-flight. In Paris, researchers battled a fungal infestation eating away at his skin, using gamma radiation to sterilize the tissue. The irony was exquisite. A pharaoh who once commanded armies now lay helpless under humming machines, his immortality dependent on the very technology he'd have called magic. Yet the scans revealed surprises beyond disease. Ramses' mummification was shockingly rushed, organs haphazardly removed, his brain fragments still clinging to the skull. This wasn't the careful work of priests preparing a god-king for eternity. It was the messy effort of a dynasty in decline, cutting corners as Egypt's golden age faded. Even his famous red hair, long debated, turned out to be a post-mortem trick of natron salts, though some specialists insist traces of henna hint at vanity in life. The ultimate twist, Ramses outlived most of his heirs, leaving a weakened succession that crumbled within decades. His mummy's journey, from forgotten tomb to museum exhibit to international celebrity, mirrors his legacy, a ruler who obsessed over permanence only to achieve it in ways he never foresaw. The arthritis, the passport, the radiation treatments, they all whisper the same humbling truth. You can chisel your name across continents, but time rewrites every story. And sometimes immortality looks less like a golden sarcophagus and more like a custom stamp on your way to Paris. Nebuchadnezzar II ruled Babylon with a blend of grandeur and paranoia that left historians debating his legacy for millennia. The legendary Hanging Gardens, one of the ancient world's 7 wonders, may or may not have been his creation. Archaeologists still can't agree if they were real or an ancient mirage. Greek historians like Strabo described terraced gardens rising like a green mountain above the Euphrates, irrigated by screw pumps lifting water from the river. But dig through Babylon's ruins and you'll find no trace of them. Some scholars argue the gardens were actually in Nineveh, built by Assyrian king Sennacherib, their fame mistakenly attributed to Nebuchadnezzar by confused Greek tourists. Others suggest the gardens were pure propaganda, a poetic metaphor for Babylon's wealth. The truth might lie in cuneiform tablets detailing Nebuchadnezzar's extensive palace renovations, including wondrous vegetation atop ziggurats, perhaps the seed that grew into an exaggerated legend. The Bible paints a far darker portrait of the king. In the book of Daniel, he's the tyrant who threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into a fiery furnace for refusing to worship a golden statue, only to witness an angel walk unscathed through the flames with them. This same ruler, according to scripture, suffered 7 years of madness, eating grass like an ox until he acknowledged Yahweh's power. Babylonian records tell a different story. No mention of insanity, only a 43-year reign marked by relentless construction and military campaigns. The dissonance reveals more about propaganda than pathology. To exiled Jews, Nebuchadnezzar was the monster who destroyed Jerusalem's temple. To his subjects, he was the builder who gilded Babylon's Ishtar Gate with dragons of lapis lazuli and paved processional way with limestone so polished it gleamed under festival torches. Beneath the myths, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a hub of scientific innovation. His astronomers tracked planetary movements with startling precision, compiling data that would later influence Greek and Islamic scholars. The Mul, pinned tablets dating to his era, catalogue constellations, planetary orbits, and even mathematical methods for predicting lunar eclipses. One theory suggests the Tower of Babel story stems from the Etemenanke ziggurat, a 7-tiered temple where priests charted the heavens, their esoteric knowledge seeming like defiance to outsiders. This wasn't just stargazing, it was statecraft. Celestial omens dictated everything from harvest schedules to military campaigns, with scribes interpreting Jupiter's position as divine approval for war. The king's own inscriptions swing between pride and insecurity. On one brick stamped with his name, he boasts of building Babylon with bitumen and baked brick from top to bottom. Yet other texts reveal nightmares where gods withdraw favor, prompting frantic temple repairs. Perhaps this duality explains his relentless construction. Each new wall and gate was both a monument to glory and a bulwark against chaos. When Herodotus visited Babylon a century later, he marveled at walls so wide 2 chariots could race atop them, never realizing they were the echoes of a king who built not just for power but for permanence. In the end, even Nebuchadnezzar couldn't outbuild time. The gardens crumbled, the ziggurats eroded, and his name became less a memory than a mirror, reflecting back whatever fears or fascinations each new generation needed to see. Nebuchadnezzar's supposed descent into madness isn't just a biblical anecdote, it's one of history's earliest recorded case studies of mental illness, wrapped in layers of myth and medico-political intrigue. The Book of Daniel describes his transformation in vivid, almost zoological terms. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. This isn't mere metaphor. Modern psychiatrists analyzing the account have proposed startlingly specific diagnoses, from clinical lycanthropy, where patients believe they're transforming into animals, to porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder causing skin sensitivity and neurological disturbances that might explain his withdrawal from sunlight. Yet the historical record complicates this narrative. Babylonian cuneiform tablets from Nebuchadnezzar's reign show no gap in royal decrees or construction projects that would suggest a 7-year absence. Instead, they depict a ruler deeply engaged in administering his empire, repairing temples, quelling rebellions, and receiving tribute. This dissonance raises fascinating questions. Was his madness a later invention by Jewish scribes to humiliate their captor, or could it encode a real event sanitized in official records? One tantalizing clue comes from the Yoruk prophecy text, which mentions a Babylonian king who will be abandoned by his protective deity and will roam the open country. The phrasing mirrors Daniel's account but frames it as divine punishment rather than mental collapse. Ancient Near Eastern perceptions of mental illness add another layer. Babylonians viewed erratic behavior not through a medical lens but as spiritual imbalance, perhaps demonic possession or divine displeasure. The famous diagnostic handbook of Esagil Kinapli, a Babylonian medical text, lists symptoms resembling depression and psychosis but prescribes rituals rather than remedies. If a man's mind is altered and he talks to himself, you shall purify the room with incense and sprinkle him with water. In this context, Nebuchadnezzar's beastly episode might symbolize not just personal suffering but the unraveling of sacred kingship, where a ruler's sanity was thought to reflect the god's favor. The most provocative modern theory reinterprets the madness as political theater. Some scholars suggest Nebuchadnezzar's withdrawal was a calculated ascetic ritual, a form of transcendental kingship where temporary renunciation of humanity reaffirmed his divine connection. Similar practices appear in other cultures, pharaohs undergoing symbolic death rebirth ceremonies or Assyrian kings wearing lion masks to channel divine fury. If true, the biblical authors may have witnessed or heard of such a ritual and recast it as divine humiliation. Whatever the truth, Nebuchadnezzar's story endures because it taps into universal anxieties about power and fragility. A king who built walls to defy time itself couldn't wall off his own mind from chaos. His legend whispers that no amount of gold or conquest can armor against the vulnerabilities of being human, and that history often remembers leaders not by their triumphs but by their most unguarded moments. Solon faced a city on the brink of civil war, Athens, in the 6th century B.C., where crushing debt had turned free farmers into slaves and the aristocracy hoarded power like gold. Unlike tyrants who seized control through force, this poet-statesman chose a radical middle path, reshaping Athenian society not with swords but with scrolls of law. His reforms struck at the root of the crisis by cancelling all outstanding debts in a single stroke, a move so revolutionary the Greeks called it the seisachtheia, the shaking off of burdens. Overnight, families who'd been sold into bondage walked free, and mortgaged land reverted to its original owners. But Solon knew economic relief alone wouldn't heal Athens. He went further, dismantling the aristocracy's monopoly by restructuring citizenship into 4 tiers based on wealth rather than birth, allowing even the poorest to serve in the assembly and sit on juries. For the first time, commoners had a voice in their own fate. Yet Solon's genius lay in his restraint. He refused to redistribute land outright or grant absolute equality, recognizing that extremism in any direction would spark backlash. "I gave the people as much privilege as they needed," he later wrote, neither stripping them of dignity nor offering them too much. His laws even prohibited exporting agricultural goods except olive oil, a shrewd move to prevent grain shortages while encouraging Athens' lucrative olive trade. The balance was delicate, enough reform to ease suffering, but not so much that the powerful would revolt. Most striking was his approach to enforcement. Solon's laws were carved onto wooden tablets set in rotating frames, ensuring they could be amended as needed, a far cry from Hammurabi's rigid stone edicts. He established the Heliaia, a people's court where any citizen could appeal decisions by magistrates, laying the groundwork for democratic oversight. Even his poetic verses doubled as civic education, circulating through Athens to explain his reforms. "Like a wolf among dogs, I stand between factions," he wrote, acknowledging the precariousness of his position. Then, in a move that baffled contemporaries, Solon did the unthinkable. He left. After decreeing that his laws must remain unchanged for 10 years, he set off to travel Egypt and Asia Minor. Some called it cowardice, others wisdom. The truth was a masterstroke of political theater. By distancing himself, Solon forced Athens to own its transformation. A country grows used to its laws, just as a child grows used to the lyre, he remarked, betting that time would legitimize his reforms better than his continued presence. His gamble paid off, though tyrants would briefly seize power later. The democratic seeds he planted survived, eventually flowering under Cleisthenes and Pericles. Solon's legacy isn't just in laws, but in the art of the possible. He proved that change need not come through revolution or tyranny, but through measured compromise that lets a society breathe again. His final lesson: true leadership sometimes means stepping aside, letting the roots you've planted grow, or fail without you. And for Athens, those roots would one day bear fruit in a system the world had never seen before: democracy. Solon wielded poetry not as mere artistry, but as a political scalpel carving his reforms into the collective consciousness of Athens. While other lawgivers etched edicts in stone, he composed verses that thrummed through the agora, transforming dry legal principles into rhythmic mantras. His elegiac couplets framed debt relief not as a revolutionary act, but as divine justice. "I freed the black earth from her mortgaged chains," he wrote, personifying the soil itself as an enslaved being liberated by his hand. This wasn't just metaphor, it was myth-making, positioning his economic policies as the will of the gods rather than the whims of a man. The brilliance lay in his dual audience. For the aristocracy, his poems balanced warning with reassurance. Lines like "Greed breeds civil war, but measured reform preserves order," flattered elites by implying they were partners in stability, not targets of upheaval. Simultaneously, his verses circulated as drinking songs among commoners, embedding ideals of fairness into popular culture. Imagine farmers singing of the rights restored by Themis scales as they pressed olives, propaganda disguised as tradition, normalizing radical change through familiar rhythms. Solon's masterstroke was appropriating religious imagery. By invoking Dike, goddess of moral order, he painted his laws as cosmic inevitabilities. The people follow their leaders as tides follow the moon. The metaphor subtly shifted blame for past injustices onto previous rulers while absolving citizens of complicity. Even his self-imposed exile found poetic justification. "I stand apart like a boundary stone between factions," elevating his departure into a sacred act of balance rather than retreat. Critics might dismiss this as manipulation, but contemporary accounts reveal its effectiveness. Later reformers like Cleisthenes built upon Solon's linguistic groundwork, proving that in Athens the pen and the lyre could be mightier than the sword. His poetry didn't just explain laws, it made them feel inevitable, weaving democracy's first threads into the fabric of the everyday. Words Solon understood are the truest monuments and is still echo wherever justice pretends to be divine. Hannibal Barca didn't just invade Rome, he rewrote the rules of war with a gamble so audacious it still staggers the imagination. Picture this: 26,000 troops, 6,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants trudging through the snow-choked Alps, a feat so improbable that Roman historians later claimed the Carthaginian general melted mountains with vinegar. The truth was far more brutal. His army faced avalanches, ambushes by hostile alpine tribes, and freezing temperatures that claimed men and animals alike. By the time they stumbled into Italy's Po Valley, nearly half his forces had perished, but the psychological impact was worth every loss. The sheer spectacle of elephants emerging from the high passes sent shockwaves through Rome. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was theater designed to shatter Roman confidence before the first battle even began. Hannibal's genius lay in turning geography into a weapon. By bypassing Rome's naval superiority and striking from the north, he transformed the Alps into his Trojan horse. His elephants, North African forest elephants, smaller than their Asian cousins but terrifying in formation, served as living siege engines, smashing through enemy lines at battles like Trebia and Trasimene. But their real power was symbolic. To Roman soldiers who'd never seen such creatures, they might as well have been dragons. Hannibal amplified this terror with psychological tricks, staging ambushes at dusk when shadows made his forces appear endless, or disguising torchbearers as a second army marching parallel to his own. Every move was calculated to make Rome's legions question whether they were fighting a man or a force of nature. Yet for all his tactical brilliance, Hannibal's strategic downfall stemmed from a single miscalculation. He expected Rome's allies to defect. After his decisive victory at Cannae, where he encircled and annihilated 50,000 Romans, he assumed Italian cities would rally to his cause. Instead, most held firm, not out of love for Rome, but because Hannibal lacked siege engines to take their walls. His light cavalry and elephants excelled in open battle but were useless against fortified cities. The delay allowed Rome to regroup under Fabius Maximus, who shadowed Hannibal's army without engaging, slowly starving it of supplies while avoiding another catastrophic battle. The final irony, Hannibal's greatest advantage, his unpredictability, became his undoing when he finally stood within sight of Rome's walls in 211 BC. His officers begged him to attack, but without siege equipment and with Roman armies converging, he chose to withdraw. Some historians argue he never intended to sack Rome, only to break its alliances. Others believe he hesitated at the critical moment, his legendary audacity faltering before the weight of history. Whatever the reason, the opportunity never came again. Hannibal's legacy isn't just in battles won or lost, but in the art of asymmetrical warfare. From Napoleon to Patton, generals have studied his Alpine crossing as a masterclass in surprise. Yet his story also warns that psychological victories mean little without a path to final conquest. The man who crossed mountains with elephants ultimately found himself stranded in Italy, a brilliant tactician trapped by his own success, watching as Rome, the very empire he'd humiliated, slowly tightened the noose. His final defeat came not on the battlefield, but in the quiet realization that some foes, no matter how outmaneuvered, refused to surrender. Hannibal's final years read like a geopolitical thriller: exile, hidden fortunes, and a death so meticulously staged it fueled conspiracy theories for centuries. After his defeat at Zama, the once invincible general became a man without a country, drifting between Mediterranean courts as a tactical advisor. Ancient historians whispered he carried war chests of Carthaginian gold, squirreled away to fund one last campaign against Rome. Plutarch claimed he buried silver in secret locations across Asia Minor, while Strabo wrote of treasure-laden ships scuttled off the coast of Bithynia. Modern expeditions have found nothing conclusive, but the rumors persist, tantalizing as ever. In 2015, Turkish archaeologists uncovered a submerged harbor near Ephesus with Carthaginian-style anchors. Was this Hannibal's last supply depot, or just another dead end in a 2,000-year-old treasure hunt? His suicide was equally shrouded in intrigue. Cornered by Roman agents in a Bithynian villa, he allegedly drank from a poisoned ring rather than face capture. But Rome's reaction to his death tells a different story. Rather than celebrating, the Senate sent envoys to investigate, not because they feared his military genius, but because his mere existence had been a bargaining chip for decades. Client kings across the Mediterranean had vied for his counsel, knowing his name alone could rally anti-Roman sentiment. With Hannibal gone, Rome lost its most potent bogeyman, the unifying threat that had justified its expansion. The geopolitical fallout was immediate. Without the specter of Carthaginian revenge, allied cities grew restless under Roman rule, and Eastern monarchs tested their boundaries. The greatest irony: in death, Hannibal achieved what eluded him in life. He became immortal. Roman schoolboys debated his tactics, emperors visited his grave, and his Alpine crossing entered military lore as the gold standard of audacity. Even his enemies couldn't resist mythologizing him. Livy, no fan of Carthage, admitted Hannibal possessed the courage to meet disaster and the capacity to rise above it. Modern special forces still study his lightning maneuvers, while political theorists dissect his fatal flaw: winning battles but losing the war of perception. Perhaps his real hidden treasure wasn't gold, but the enduring lesson that no single victory, however spectacular, can undo a system built to outlast its conquerors. Hannibal's story ends not with a chest of plundered coins, but with a warning etched across history: sometimes the cost of defiance isn't defeat, but becoming exactly what your enemies need you to be. Mansa Musa didn't just travel to Mecca in 1324, he recalibrated the global economy along the way. The Mali Empire's ruler embarked on his legendary Hajj with a caravan so lavish it defied comprehension: 60,000 attendants, 12,000 slaves draped in Persian silk, and 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of pure gold dust. But it was his stop in Cairo that etched his name into economic history. As he distributed gold to the city's poor and merchants, the sudden influx of wealth flooded the markets. Contemporary Arab historian al-Umri recorded the aftermath. Gold's value in Cairo plummeted by nearly 20% and took over a decade to recover. This wasn't charity, it was an unintentional masterclass in monetary policy, showcasing how one man's generosity could destabilize an entire region's financial system. The scale of Mali's wealth becomes even clearer when translated to modern terms. Economists estimate Mansa Musa's net worth adjusted for inflation would exceed $400 billion today, more than twice Jeff Bezos's peak wealth. His empire controlled nearly half the world's gold supply, mined from the Bambuk fields along the Senegal River. Unlike European monarchs who hoarded treasure in vaults, Musa understood gold's real power lay in circulation. He commissioned mosques with spires topped in gold leaf and funded universities where scholars debated beneath ceilings inlaid with precious metals. The message was unmistakable. Wealth wasn't for hiding but for transforming society. Timbuktu's intellectual renaissance stands as his most enduring legacy. With the riches from his Hajj, Musa recruited the Mediterranean's finest minds, Arab mathematicians, Andalusian architects, and Persian poets, turning the desert city into the Oxford of Africa. The Sankore University Library amassed over 700,000 manuscripts on topics from astronomy to medicine, its collection rivaling the Library of Alexandria. Catalan cartographer Abraham Cresques even featured Musa on his 1375 Catalan atlas, seated atop a golden throne holding a nugget the size of his fist, an image that cemented Mali in the European imagination as a land of unimaginable riches. Yet Musa's spending spree had unintended consequences. The gold-saturated markets attracted Venetian and Genoese traders who funneled African wealth into Europe's burgeoning banking systems. Some historians argue this influx helped fund the Renaissance, making Musa an unwitting patron of Da Vinci and Michelangelo. Others point to the darker aftermath. European greed, stoked by tales of Mali's gold, would later fuel the transatlantic slave trade as explorers sought replicas of Musa's wealth. The paradox of Mansa Musa is that the very gestures meant to showcase his empire's grandeur, the gifts, the mosques, the scholarships, also made it a target. His story isn't just about opulence, but about the double-edged nature of visibility. In an age when kings measured power by how much gold they could display, Musa proved that true influence isn't just having wealth, but knowing how to deploy it, even when the world isn't ready for the consequences. Mansa Musa's gold may have dazzled the world, but his most tantalizing secret might lie beneath the Atlantic waves. Long before Columbus set sail, whispers persisted that the Malian emperor sent a fleet of ships westward into the oceans unknown, a bold venture lost to time, or perhaps buried in the seafloor's silt. The primary source comes from Arab historian al-Umri, who recorded Musa's claim during his Cairo visit. His predecessor, Abubakar II, allegedly abdicated the throne to explore the Atlantic with 2,000 vessels, vanishing without a trace. Skeptics dismiss this as myth, but compelling clues linger. In 2018, a team of underwater archaeologists scanning the Caribbean's shallows near Jamaica found anomalous wooden remnants carbon dated to the 1300 centuries before European contact. The wreck's construction bore distinct West African hallmarks, plank lashing techniques matching Mali's boat builders, not Spanish caravels. Even more intriguing, sediment layers around the site contained gold particles matching the unique impurities of Bambuk gold, Musa's signature export. Could this be a ghost from Abubakar's lost fleet carried by currents to Caribbean reefs, or merely coincidental debris from later slave trade ships? The debate rages, but the find reignited interest in Mali's maritime potential. The skeptic's strongest argument is technological. how could Malian ships designed for river trade survive the Atlantic's fury? Yet surviving accounts describe vessels capable of carrying 80 tons comparable to Columbus's Nina, and Mali's access to Saharan trade routes meant they had maps detailing the Canary Current, a natural conveyor belt to the Americas. Portuguese archives even note 14th century reports of black sailors arriving in Lisbon with tales of western lands, long before their own explorers ventured south. The mystery deepens with linguistic traces. When Columbus reached the Caribbean, the indigenous Taino people already had a word for African traders, guanin. This wasn't borrowed Spanish. It derived from the Mandinka term wakar, meaning wealth. Even stranger, Taino artifacts include gold alloys with metallurgical signatures identical to Malian techniques, suggesting pre-existing contact. Were these vestiges of fleeting Malian landfalls or evidence of sustained exchange? Modern searches continue off Brazil's coast, where oral histories speak of bearded strangers arriving in long canoes before the Portuguese. In 2021, sonar detected a submerged structure near Recife resembling a stone dock, an anomaly in a region with no native seafaring culture. Dive teams found nothing conclusive, but the hunt persists, fueled by Mali's own griot traditions, which speak of the king who chased the sunset. Whether myth or history, the tale of Mansa Musa's missing fleet forces us to reconsider the Atlantic not as a barrier but as a highway, one that ambitious empires might have traveled long before Europe's so-called Age of Discovery. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but every sunken timber and gold fleck whispers a tantalizing question. What if history's map is missing a continent-spanning connection? Confucius never wrote a single book, yet his ideas became the bedrock of East Asian civilization for 2,000 years. The sage who wandered ancient China offering wisdom on everything from governance to family harmony, left behind no manuscripts, only fragments of conversation remembered by disciples. It was these followers, generations after his death, who scrambled to compile his teachings into the Analects, stitching together recollections like scholars reassembling a shattered vase. The process was anything but orderly. Some passages contradict others, hinting at rival schools of interpretation even among his closest students. One chapter insists rulers must lead by moral example, while another suggests they can use punishment when necessary, a tension that later dynasties would exploit to justify both benevolence and brutality in Confucius's name. The real transformation came when Emperor Wu of Han Dynasty enshrined Confucianism as state ideology in the 2nd century B.C.E. Suddenly, officials needed to master the Analects to climb the bureaucratic ladder. But here's the twist: the version they studied was heavily edited. Whole sections emphasizing merit over noble birth were downplayed, while passages about loyalty to authority got amplified. The civil service exams, which ran for over 1,300 years, turned Confucian study into a grueling marathon. Candidates memorized thousands of characters, their futures hinging on flawless calligraphy and poetic allusions to cherry blossom skills that had little to do with actual governance but everything to do with maintaining a scholarly elite. Modern misunderstandings compound the distortion. Western audiences often reduce Confucius to fortune cookie platitudes about respect and harmony, missing the radical edge of his original vision. His emphasis on Ren, often translated as benevolence, wasn't just about being nice. It demanded dismantling rigid class hierarchies. A disciple once asked if it was acceptable to sacrifice a lamb for a ritual, and Confucius snapped, "You care about the lamb, I care about the person." This wasn't empty piety, but a challenge to prioritize human welfare over blind tradition. Yet authoritarian regimes from imperial China to modern Singapore have cherry-picked his emphasis on social order to suppress dissent, turning a philosopher who valued critical thinking into a mascot for conformity. Recent archaeology has added fascinating wrinkles. Bamboo slips discovered in 1993 in a Han Dynasty tomb contain analects passages that differ dramatically from standardized versions, including one where Confucius explicitly rejects blind obedience to rulers. Such finds suggest his teachings were far more subversive before empires sanitized them. Meanwhile, in 21st century Silicon Valley, tech executives ironically invoke Confucian values to justify long work hours, ignoring the sage's insistence that true learning requires leisure and reflection. Perhaps the most enduring paradox is this: a man who spoke of humility and self-cultivation became the unwilling patron saint of systems he might have criticized. His ideas on education as empowerment were revolutionary, yet they got codified into rote memorization. His dialogues celebrated questioning, yet they were used to enforce orthodoxy. The real Confucius lies somewhere between the bronze statues and the bamboo slips, not a purveyor of tidy answers, but a provocateur who understood that wisdom, like history, is always being rewritten. Confucius dreamed of advising rulers as a sage minister, guiding them toward virtuous governance, but reality delivered a harsh lesson in political rejection. For decades, he traveled between warring states, offering counsel to dukes and kings who praised his wisdom yet consistently ignored his advice. In the state of Lu, his home territory, he briefly served as Minister of Justice, implementing reforms like reducing extravagant funeral rites and cracking down on corrupt officials. For a fleeting moment, it seemed his philosophy might translate into policy. Then the neighboring state of Kai grew nervous at Lu's rising stability and sent the ruling duke a gift of 80 exquisite dancing girls. The ruler abandoned his duties, Confucius resigned in disgust, and his political career unraveled into a series of humiliating snubs. The man who preached rectification of names, the idea that rulers must live up to their titles, found himself sidelined by leaders who preferred power over principles. His time in the state of Wei proved even more disillusioning. Duke Ling, intrigued by Confucius's reputation, granted him an audience but cared more about military tactics than moral cultivation. When the philosopher criticized the duke's infamous consort Nanzi for her political meddling, he was forced to flee amid rumors of assassination plots. The incident reveals a tragic irony. Confucius's insistence on moral purity often alienated the very rulers he sought to transform. While his disciples revered his unbending integrity, pragmatic leaders saw him as a threat to their webs of compromise and intrigue. Even his admirers acknowledged the disconnect. The Analects record him sighing, "No one understands me, not as self-pity, but as frustration that his nuanced ethics were reduced to impractical idealism." Yet these failures forged his lasting influence. Exile turned Confucius into China's first private teacher, shifting his focus from transforming courts to shaping minds. His academy welcomed students of all classes, a radical democratization of knowledge in an era of rigid hierarchies. Among them were future officials who would embed his ideas in Chinese bureaucracy centuries later. The contrast is striking. The man who couldn't persuade one duke ultimately reshaped an entire civilization's governance by working outside the system. The tension between his political frustration and philosophical triumph raises a timeless question. Is real change made from within power structures or through the slow cultivation of alternatives? Confucius's life suggests the answer is both, and neither. His direct interventions failed, but his indirect influence endured because he planted seeds in fertile ground, young minds willing to balance idealism with pragmatism. Perhaps his greatest lesson wasn't in his successes, but in his stubborn refusal to let failure define his legacy, proving that sometimes the most powerful throne is a classroom's humble stool. The echoes of these ancient leaders aren't confined to dusty scrolls or crumbling ruins. They pulse through the very structures of our modern world. Hammurabi's eye for an eye, principle still, whispers in courtrooms where proportional justice is debated. Ashoka's pillars, with their edicts on tolerance and public welfare, find their heirs in constitutions that promise equality and health care. Even Qin Shi Huang's brutal standardization lives on in the unspoken rules that shape our daily lives, from the width of train tracks to the alphabets on our keyboards. These rulers didn't just command armies or build cities. They wired the operating system of civilization, embedding their visions so deeply that we often mistake their innovations for inevitabilities. But their influence isn't just institutional, it's cultural, even psychological. Cleopatra's mastery of image and political theater foreshadowed the carefully curated personas of modern leaders, where perception often outweighs policy. Pericles' funeral oration, with its celebration of democratic duty, still resonates in speeches that tie national identity to collective sacrifice. And Mansa Musa's Hajj, which flooded economies with gold, feels eerily familiar in an age where a single tweet from a billionaire can send markets spiraling. The past isn't a foreign country, it's a mirror reflecting our own struggles with power, identity, and the weight of legacy. Yet for all their grandeur, these leaders were also cautionary tales. Cyrus the Great's tolerance couldn't prevent Persia's eventual fragmentation. Boudicca's rebellion, though righteous, only hastened Roman repression. And Julius Caesar's quest for absolute authority exposed the fragility of republics, a lesson that reverberates whenever democracies teeter on the brink of autocracy. Their triumphs and failures remind us that history isn't just about what happened, but what could happen again given the right or wrong circumstances. So here's where we turn the page to you. Step outside and trace the fingerprints of these rulers in your own city, the laws, the monuments, even the roads beneath your feet. Or dive into the comments and debate who left the deepest mark. Was it the unifier like Chandragupta, the disruptor like Alexander, or the philosopher like Confucius, whose ideals outlasted empires? History isn't a monologue, it's a conversation stretching across millennia, and now it's your turn to speak.